The implied message here is that if you trust Jesus enough, you're not going to struggle with ADHD, you're not going to struggle with PTSD, you're not going to struggle with other kinds of mental illnesses, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that. I know a lot of people. In fact, I know a couple people that trust Jesus, I would say, in many ways more than I do, that struggle with mental illness. And it communicates that somehow they're not laying hold of the truth of the gospel or really trusting or following Jesus enough. And that's just not true. That's just not how mental illness works.
Right.
This is Fixed on Jesus. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fixed on Jesus. My name is Rich. As always, I am your host here with this podcast that's just growing ever popular. And across the table from me, we have Mark Johnson Jr.
Here I am.
And behind the glass, Heather Corbitt. Now, Heather, there's a new feature we have now, I think, Mark, correct?
Yeah, we have tinted glass for her.
No, we're not talking about the glass. We're talking, this is an audio. Yeah,
Oh.
The glass is a metaphorical glass. Mark.
Okay. Glad you could clear that up.
Yeah. But Heather has a microphone. Now she can say hello to everybody. Do you want to say hi to everyone, Heather?
Hi, everyone.
There we go. That's right. She's got to talk back. Yeah. So if we color outside the lines, we're going to get talked to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what are we talking about, Mark?
Well, the question is mental illness real? But I want to tell you why I'm asking it.
Okay.
So there was recently in the media some.
You can name him.
I can name him. Okay.
I mean,
John MacArthur.
John MacArthur, right?
Said
right.
some things that I'm not going to comment on. I'm just going to read one quote from it, and we'll go from there.
All right.
Quote, "The major noble lie is that there's such a thing as mental illness." End quote.
Yeah.
So what do you think he's saying, first of all?
Well, I think he's pretty clear there with what he's saying.
Yeah,
he's saying he doesn't believe in mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things I've always appreciated about John MacArthur is that he's willing to come out and say what he believes. Mm-hmm. And nearly always it's a benefit and it's a blessing to the church, and it's something that we can all learn from. And his ministry is he's been preaching the Bible for longer than I've been alive. So there's something about the longevity and such that the Lord's blessed him with that I want to respect and say, that's good. But when he says something like this, I think he's wrong. Absolutely, totally wrong.
Yeah.
Because is there such a thing as mental illness? Absolutely. The brain is our brains can be damaged, and being damaged, it can cause problems with our personalities, with how we think, with all of those kinds of things. I mean, none of us would ever deny that a physical problem can affect somebody's life, right?
Right.
So, somebody who has, maybe like me, bad knee joints, nobody's going to say, hey, listen, you should just not really worry about those knee joints and just press through the pain. And if the pain isn't real, it's just in your mind. And so just go on with life as normal and you should be okay.
Or if you follow Jesus more,
and that's
go away.
No, that's just not true. Now, mental illness. I mean, I've interacted with, and we have people here at our church who struggle with mental illness, and so to communicate to those people that this is not real is
that's what I was going to ask. Like, how, what effect would that have on someone who is struggling with mental illness if they heard that?
Well, I think it somehow communicates to them that somehow they are either not believing or trusting in Jesus enough, because the implied message here is that if you trust Jesus enough, you're not going to struggle with ADHD, you're not going to struggle with PTSD, you're not going to struggle with other kinds of mental illnesses, and that's just not true. Yeah. I mean, we know that. I know a lot of people. In fact, I know a couple people that trust Jesus, I would say, in many ways more than I do, that struggle with mental illness, and it communicates that somehow they're not laying hold of the truth of the gospel or really trusting or following Jesus enough. And that's just not true. That's just not how mental illness works.
Right.
Now, I do think one of the things he's probably trying to say is that our culture today is overly medicated. And I would say absolutely true. We have a culture that tries to find all the answers for all the problems in all the world through medication. And that is absolutely true, that we have a bunch of people that are overly medicated. But that doesn't mean that mental illness is not a real thing.
Yeah.
The effect on people is that we essentially, if we say mental illness isn't real, what we're telling people is you need to just obey Jesus better. You need to follow Jesus more closely. You need to make sure that you're becoming a more compelling kind of Christian. And if you are, you won't struggle this way. And that's just not true.
Yeah.
It's just not true. We don't counsel people in any way, shape, or form like that. And I've been in ministry now for almost a quarter of a century, and I've talked to people who have mental illness, and it's a real thing. Yeah. And it's something that dogs and affects their lives at a real fundamental level.
Yeah.
In fact, there's an individual I love that I go out to coffee with on a regular basis who struggles with some mental illness. He's got a job, he's living his life, and just a wonderful member of our church that we love and cherish.
Yeah, he's awesome.
He's great, but he struggles with mental illness. And if I sat across the table from him at Starbucks and told him that the illness that he's struggling with is not real and all he has to do is pray more, that would do him a massive disservice, because it's just not true. He's struggling with some things that are difficult to define or encapsulate that's going on in his mind, and I don't want to communicate in any way, shape, or form to him that the answer is only just him trying harder.
Yeah.
That's just not the case. It's not the case. And all of us who are shepherds here at our church, we recognize there is such a thing as mental illness, and it affects people. It affects the person that has the mental illness. It also affects the family. So that's the other thing that bothers me about this statement by Dr. MacArthur, as well-meaning as it is all the people who are caregivers for individuals with mental illness. He's communicating to them that they're doing all this work and their lives are disrupted for nothing, for really nothing. And really what they're doing is believing and living in accordance with a lie.
Noble lie.
Yeah, that's just like, I know people whose lives have been turned upside down because one of their loved ones has mental illness, and they've reoriented their life's mission. They've done all kinds of things. And to have someone like John MacArthur say this is just a noble lie communicates that what they're doing is either a waste or foolish or just not worthwhile.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing another way it affects people is we've talked to so many people who have either children with mental illness or they're trying to care for someone with mental illness, and they've been kicked out of other churches. So
Wow.
they'll come to us and say,
Yeah.
well, I was kicked out of our last church because, because of this or that reason, or sometimes my son or the person I'm trying to care is disruptive. And so we'd much rather let them come and be themselves and not worry about whether or not they fit into the mold of what it looks like the quote unquote normal person. Because we've got these people, they need to hear the gospel too. They need to have relationship. They need to have people connecting with them. It's not always going to be convenient. It's not always going to be easy, but to talk to someone who is a caregiver and say, hey, listen, your son, your daughter, that's not real what they're struggling with.
Wow.
And what's turned your life upside down, it's not real. That's just not true. That's just not helpful.
Yeah.
That's just not true. And I understand people are over medicated, but that does not negate the reality of mental illness.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I also just think about what Christ's response would be to those people. he wouldn't shut the door on them or kick them out of a church or
Well, yeah, I
say
don't.
they're disruptive.
Yeah, well, I mean, he would. I think his whole pattern was to pursue the least of these,
Exactly.
and just to defend MacArthur. MacArthur's not saying Jesus,
Right. And I didn't mean to imply that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I'm not trying to say that either, but like the churches that do cut people out that because they struggle with mental illness, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
That's like churches are places that everybody should be able to come to because the church is a hospital. It's full of people who are aware they're sick,
Yeah.
that need
Spiritually.
that need the remedy of Jesus Christ. And so, for most of us or many of us, that's just the normal sin that we carry around. But for some people, it's a limitation, a weakness, a mental inability that they're never going to be able to overcome in this life. But even at the level they can understand, they can trust Jesus. And I mean, we look to serve people with mental illness and not try to tell them that it's not real.
Yeah. Just some follow-ups. I know that
Yeah.
you mentioned ADHD and PTSD as something that people struggle with.
Yeah.
What about depression?
Yeah.
How does that fit into what MacArthur's saying, but also just reality?
Yeah. Like, can a Christian be depressed?
Can a Christian be depressed? And even more, I'll take it even further and say, is it real?
Yeah. Or even, is every bit of depression sin?
Is it sin? Is it real? Is it miscategorized with the word? Like, are you just sad, or are you like chemically depressed?
Well, see, I think that's where it gets difficult. I mean, is depression real? Absolutely, it's real. I mean, and that's one of the things that that affected me in ways like I never thought about depression. I never thought about that kind of thing before I became a pastor. But then when you have certain things happen to you and you have trials and tribulations and hardships that come, I've been in a dark spot before where I would say I was depressed. And was that completely and totally 100% sin? I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean and there were times where I felt sorrowful and I had just, I had dark feelings and, just everything seemed hopeless. And that was something that, surely there was an element of sin, but at the same time, I was affected by the things I had gone through. And so, so that's one of the reasons for me that I have found that reading the Psalms on a daily basis is helpful because fully 1/3 of the Psalms are Psalms of lament.
What does that mean for some of us?
Yeah, for lament means it's those Psalms that cry out to God and say, "Why?" or "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
Right? So you get these Psalms of lament that are significant. I mean, I'll just give you a quick example of a psalm of lament, and you can read them all over the Psalter. But one of the most famous ones is Psalm 13 that says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" So here's this psalmist, right? Here's this guy who, well, we know the guy who he is he's David. So here's David. David is saying, how long, right? He's clearly struggling with something.
Yeah.
And he clearly thinks God's not listening, right? And so, but yet he still expresses his feelings of discouragement. He still expresses his feelings of abandonment, and he doesn't sort of couch those in Christianese kind of terms like, "Lord, I know I could be wrong, and I know that these things are things that you're under your sovereign control, but where are you?" No, he just doesn't. He doesn't put any kind of varnish over top of it. He just says, "Here's how I feel, and here's what I say," right? And that's an expression of like what's going on. And so it's a super helpful tool to recognize in the Psalter that, wow, we've got people here who've gone through things like I've gone through and other people who've gone through more significant things than me, and they cry out to the Lord and say, "Where are you? What's going on? Help."
Yeah.
Right? And so is depression real? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's something that I've battled in the past, and to some degree, I still have to battle on a regular basis. And it's not just a quick magic, like, let me pray a prayer, let me read the Bible, let me make sure that I'm doing X, Y, and Z, and then all of a sudden I'm better and everything's fine and there's no problem at all.
Yeah.
That's just not how it works.
Yeah, I hope it didn't come across as I was saying it wasn't real. I was
No,
just
of
asking
course
for the
not.
sake
Yeah,
of
right. No, you're
question,
asking for the
for
yeah.
debate, not
Yeah.
debate, but more so just
Just
intellectual.
conversational. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, right.
Thank you for sharing your experience, though. I think that could be very helpful
Well, sure,
to others.
of course.
I'm thankful that that's not something that I've dealt with personally, but I don't want to remain in my ignorance.
Well, in the Christian church, you have a whole array of people who struggle with all different kinds of things. So everybody's sick, but they're sick with different things.
Right. Though that's kind of what would lead right into my next question.
Yeah.
Is the category of these things, all mental illness and ADHD, depression, PTSD, are they just because we live in a fallen world?
Yeah.
That's
when you read, say, Hebrews chapter 12, the author says to throw aside every weight and sin. Right? There's some things that are sins. There's some things that weigh us down that we can throw off. But then there's also weaknesses that we have.
Yeah.
Some of us just are born with different weaknesses. Some of us have physical weaknesses. Some of us have mental weaknesses. Some of us have different kinds of weaknesses. And so the weaknesses that we live with are weaknesses because we live in a fallen world. Like one of the weaknesses you live with is the fact that you have a hard time hearing, right?
Yeah, I was born hearing impaired.
Right. And so that's a weakness. That's not because you sinned. That's not because your parents sinned.
I was going to ask that next, so thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, right, exactly. But it's because we live in a fallen world where sin has entered the world, and when sin came into the world, death followed after, and sickness and disease and all kinds of different weaknesses that dog the human race. That is because we live in a world that's fallen. Now, one day, there will be a place where there will be no mental illness, and there will be no need for hearing aids and glasses, and those kinds of physical problems will be done away with forever.
Yeah. So just to follow that up, I think as of now, this is my last question, but who knows what's going to come up.
You never know, right? Yeah. Exactly.
Is it wrong to take medication?
Like, would you take medication if you had a headache?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are you saying is it
most of the time, not every time?
Okay, but are you saying is it wrong for Christians to
Yes.
take medication?
Yes. Is it morally wrong as a Christian to take medication? And I want to distinguish between prescribed for your specific condition, but also just self-medication.
Well, those are two different things, aren't they?
I know.
Right, yeah. And so that's one of the things with depression. I'll speak to depression in particular, and so because I've experienced that personally. And so ADHD, and I've known people that have taken medication for ADHD to help them focus, and it's made a world of difference.
And these are Christians.
Yeah, absolutely. And then folks that have PTSD and others that have had depression that take medication, and it's a means of grace where the Lord uses the benefit of the advanced medical knowledge that we have now here in the Western world, and it gives people an advantage and it helps people to think more clearly and to be able to live in a way that's more quote-unquote normal.
Yeah.
And so I think to use a broad brush and say it is wrong for any Christian to take medication is wrong-headed.
Yeah.
And it's
too broad.
It's too broad, but it's also, I just don't think it's correct. It just denies the fact that there are real situations where medication could do real good for people.
Yeah.
And so now, do we live in a culture that's overly medicated?
Yes.
No question, for sure. Absolutely, right? And so sometimes what people have done in our culture recently is they've identified themselves as victims when what they really have gone through are the just difficult things in life, right? So we have a culture right now they're experts in identifying themselves as victims. And sometimes really all it is they've gone through some tough things that everybody have to go through, to make it through in the world, right? And they take medication, and they probably just need to get up, get going, and just toughen up a bit, right?
Right.
That's not what we're talking about. So being overly medicated is a problem, but that doesn't mean that there's no place for medication for a Christian, right?
Yeah.
So it could be that someone who struggles with depression takes some medication, and that medication allows them just to have a little bit of a leg up so that everything doesn't feel so dark or hopeless, so that the day as they wake up doesn't seem like something that's far too big for them or too too significant for them where they might as well just stay in bed and not even try.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's not an answer, but it's part of the solution, right?
Yeah.
And then if it gives them the opportunity to be able to have a clear-headed perspective of Jesus and say, okay, I know here I'm going to take my medication. I know that this isn't the answer, but I can focus a little bit more clearly on the Lord, his promises, and how I can trust him. That's going to help. And so to say that there's no place for medication in the life of a Christian, I think is wrong.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean every place and every time we should always medicate ourselves, right?
Yeah. I'm glad you distinguished that.
Well, and the other thing is, I've seen this with people who struggle with PTSD and depression. Oftentimes they'll self-medicate. And they are not thinking about they're doing this. Like they self-medicate with video games, they self-medicate with alcohol, they self-medicate with leisure, they self-medicate with pot, they self-medicate with porn, they self-medicate with sports, they self-medicate in a whole host of
Any kind of
ways.
idolatry.
Any kind of idolatry. They self-medicate with all kinds of different things just to cope with what's going on inside their head.
Been there.
We've all struggled in those kinds of things. So like that kind of self-medication is really dangerous.
Yeah.
And so this is where if someone feels like, man, I'm struggling with depression and I don't know what to do, right? I think it's worthwhile to talk to a doctor, get a physical, find out if there's something wrong with their physical bodies. And their minds, if there's a way they can measure that kind of thing. And then also talk to mature Christians. I mean, talk to other Christians and just say, hey, what do you think? This is what the doctor's telling me. This is how I feel. Help me.
Yeah, and it seems like that person seeking wisdom would probably get a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah.
Amongst faithful Christians.
And that doesn't mean, though, that you should talk to everybody.
Yeah.
But you can talk to those you trust, right? People who you've seen are more mature than you or have been around the block following Jesus longer than you and just say, hey, what do you think? Here's what I'm dealing with.
Yeah, no, that's great. Do you have anything more? I wanted to just tell them about a couple of resources, but unless you have another thing.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
I thought I was going to think of another question, but it looks like I'm all out.
All right, so you're going to tell us. Tell us about a couple things.
We're talking about an interview that was done on John MacArthur, and we're going to have a link in the description, in the show notes, if you want to jump through and find that. And there's also a response. So that first one is an interview where John MacArthur is saying some of the things we quoted earlier in this episode. And then both Rich and I looked at a response by Gavin Ortland, and it was very gracious, and he was similar to how we were, lovingly refuting what was being said and trying to get in the Bible about it and have grace and love for the subject and for the people that this affects, whether caregivers or people struggling with mental illness. So we're going to put both of those in the show notes. And if you have any additional questions about this, feel free to reach out to us at production@centergilbert.com. Thank you so much for tuning in and all the great encouragement and emails we've been getting, which you'll hear in another episode. But.
Yeah, and another thing, like if you are struggling with depression or anxiety or things like this, sometimes you can think it's not godly to tell anybody, or I just need to suffer in silence. That is not the answer. Isolation from other Christians is never the answer. And so if you're caregiving somebody who's struggling, like you need help. This is not something that people are designed to go through by themselves. And so if that's you, really, let me just urge you to talk to a mature Christian, maybe your pastor, somebody who can just help you and come alongside you and help you know you're not alone, because this is the kind of thing that is very difficult. And that's one of the other concerns I have about what MacArthur said, is people will be thinking, well, it's just in my head and I can't ask for help because this isn't real. And they'll talk to other Christians and think, well, or they won't talk to other Christians because they'll just say it's not real. And that's just not helpful.
No.
It's not helpful. You need help. If you're struggling with depression, anxiety, if you're struggling with PTSD, ADHD, other things, you need help and you need to get help.
And that's the actual noble thing.
Absolutely.
Asking.
That's right. The noble thing is raising your hand. So anyway, if you have questions or clarifications or anything like that, please email us at production@centergilbert.com.
That's right. And you'll hear this.
the email bell will go off.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We just love you.
See you later, everybody.